matter expert. We're going to present about systematically approach vulnerability management. Please welcome Mr. Rizaki.
Thank you, Shah. Hello. Okay. We wait dulu.
Please have your seat first. The session about to start, yeah? Come and take your seat. Welcome, sir. Please take your seat, sir.
Hello, testing. Okay. Okay, tak suara apa mic mahal macam tu lah. Ni kalau kat karaoke ada mic macam ni tak?
Yeah, maybe you can start with karaoke session. Come, ladies and gentlemen, take your seat here. You are welcome to station 1, please. Thank you.
Okay lah. Nampak tak?
So while waiting for the guests, Mr. Rizaki, can I ask you something?
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So basically, is this the first time that you come to exhibition or presenting the ideas?
I think this is my second time presenting.
Okay.
my
Where is it
ideas.
before?
First one is on PODIUM at Cyber DSA last year.
I see. Great. So how how
It's
long?
a smaller space.
Smaller space.
But the audience is quite ni lah.
I see. Great.
I think this one we have a very big space. So
Agreed?
hopefully our audience will be bigger.
Yeah, the audience is actually waiting for your presentation. Okay.
Okay, let's start with the Nila. All right. Okay, for today topics, I'm going to present about systematically approach visibility management, not on the technical term, but more on the IT governance terms. Okay. My name is Rizaki Napi. 20 years experience in IT industry, mostly in IT operation and IT security operations. So my experience is more on doing IT security works as an operation. Okay, let's start with our concept of managing cybersecurity, where we categorize the cybersecurity life cycles into four segments. We start with the prescribed part, which we are managing the policies, control, and risk of ITs. And then after that, the next categorize is when we practice our cybersecurity technology based on current technology and design. The core part is where we work with our SOC and tools like risk-based vulnerability management to look into threat. And the last part is a cyber knowledge part where we share our knowledge with our expert and go into training and certifications. We approach cybersecurity based on the RAVE concept, which we ready, where we prepare for our upcoming cyber threat. We are agile, where we predict, prevent, and detect any cybersecurity issues. We are vigilant, where we prevent our attacks by reducing our cyber exposure and be efficient in resolving cybersecurity issue. This is the RAVE concept that we were promoting when managing IT securities. But for today's presentation, I just focus on what we call a prescribed pod services, specifically into vulnerability management. Okay, talking about vulnerability management on IT, definition, we see a weakness in information system that could be exploited and by a threat source. That's a standard definition by NIST. But when we translate the definition into a graphic, what we see is actually, it's not like just a simple one wording. Vulnerability is not like, we have the biggest one, the technical assets vulnerabilities. And then we have also human asset vulnerabilities. So when looking into previous section, we have a ransomware. We have software vulnerability, data exposure, misconfiguration, shadow IT, and all other vulnerability. It's a lot to manage. But on the human part, we have phishing and also a remote workforce problem on vulnerability. So if we are not managing the vulnerability, it's easy for threat actor to penetrate our organization. Okay. So systematically managing our infrastructure or our information system, we are following the roadmap of standards framework. So looking into documentation, first we have standards and framework. Standards like ISO 27000, ISMS, we have the NIST cybersecurity framework to follow. Next is actually the organization policy that follow the standards. The next one is the procedure, which is technical people refer to. And then reports and formats or checklist. The first two is managed by the upper management. And for technical operation, they will go into this, refer to all this document, the procedure, the reports and the form in managing day-to-day operations. Okay, let's look into what. Okay, when we are managing vulnerabilities, we refer to the ISO standard 27000. 2022 is the latest, but now most of the organization is actually referring to the 2013 ISO. So the ISO started, there's a class control, started at class 6. So everything class 6 and above is mandatory to follow on the ISO punya term. But for operation people, they will refer to the ISO class 6.1.3, which is information security risk treatment, where inside that they said we have to determine all control necessary. When you are protecting your infrastructure, you must determine the control necessary. And then the control, you can refer to what they call an Annex A at the end of the standard. So what is control? Control in ISO is actually a list of activities that need to be analyzed and adapt to the organization. For ISO, they have 114 control. So there is detail, but you is actually need to justify when to use or not to use the control. It's not a mandatory control, you have to follow everything, because 114 is quite a lot of number of control you need to implement. But what they say is actually, not only you can refer to the control on Annex A, but also you can refer to other control, cybersecurity control that's available in the market. Seems like you can choose the NIST, American punya ni, cybersecurity framework controls, or you can choose to use CIS by SAN control. So you can choose any control that relates to your organization, but please refer also to the Annex A. So they don't want you to miss some control that is important. Okay. So from Annex A, we see what is, they talk about the definition. Okay. So they call the document is 27002 or the Annex A. So Annex A is actually Information Security Control Reference. So they have multiple control, but related to vulnerability is on the segment 8.8, technological control, which is management of technical vulnerability. So what the control is? They just inform, kata, information about technical vulnerability of information system shall be obtained. We must obtain the technical vulnerability of our information system and the organization exposure to such vulnerability shall be evaluated and appropriate measure shall be taken. Which means that you must know your vulnerability, identify your vulnerability, and then exposure to the organization and make sure you evaluate the vulnerability, whether you should treat or you do something about it. If you don't want to treat your exposure, it's also okay, but you must justify. Some vulnerability you don't need to treat because sometimes the treatment cost is too high for you. Something like your old system still on old Windows 2003, right? So Windows 2003 is already end of life, end of support, but you still need to use that system. But to upgrade the system into a new platform, you may have to recompile all this application, recode back, which is quite costly. But if the system is only used by internal numbers of people, but not everyone, you can treat it different way. You may put it into a isolate environment and only allow access from selected people. So that is means you may or may not you have to evaluate an appropriate measure. You do not leave all this vulnerability without treatment. So that is the recommendation of the ISO. So ISO recommend this type of measure. But how do organizations approach and adapt to the recommendation by the ISO? Normally, they will put it into ICT policy or cyber security policy. Government, they have what we call DKICT or cyber security policy, CPS. Okay, then this wording come up from one of the government punya cyber security policy lah. It's on Malay. It's called pengurusan kerentangan technical or technical vulnerability management. Objective is to make sure the control of vulnerability technically are efficient, systematic and scheduled, berkala. Dengan mengambil langkah yang bersesuaian is appropriate measure untuk menjamin keberkesanannya to make sure it's effective. Okay, the translation is actually a direct translation of the ISO requirement with additional activities, because policy is like that. It's very simple, but measure that it can be. But they add another thing saying like melaksanakan ujian penembusan untuk memperolehi maklumat kerentanan. It's called a SPA, Security Posture Assessment. They need to do a security posture assessment for the organization, and then do an analysis of the risk. And the third is taking action to control the risk. It's all about control. So policy is brief. Okay, so everyone refer to the policy and do all the work. But for technical person, this simple wording it generate a lot of activity for them. It seems simple, but there's a lot of activity. The next, after the policy, the technical people will have to translate into a procedure. For ISO, actually, the implementation guide, the detail, they said a lot of things need to be implemented. Like one, organizations are defined roles and responsibility. Who are managing the vulnerability? A timeline should define. So when you are managing vulnerability, when you found a vulnerability, you should manage a timeline and define the timeline to react to the vulnerability. Okay, and then technical vulnerability management process should be regularly monitored, which means you have to assign people to identify, make sure they know the vulnerability, and then make a timeline to resolve the risk or do a risk assessment whether they need to counter the vulnerability or not. And then there's other details like from A to I. This is the recommendation from the ISO, but it's up to the organization to translate it into their own procedure. Then the translation on the procedure, normally they've said they come out with a procedure of patch management. I don't see any procedure for vulnerability management, but they come out like a patch management procedure to counter on the vulnerability. Then sometimes like we have a introduction of the procedure, the process flow, the requirement, the responsibility is all put into the procedure. So, but be careful, yeah, because anything you put into your procedure will become your day-to-day activity, and it's a lot of work in managing vulnerability. Like when we say there's one line defining the vulnerability, but the impact is there's a whole lot of vulnerability that you need to manage. So the same as procedure. You have a single procedure with all this process something, but the works have to be done. One of the things that we look into when putting up the procedure for the patch management is actually the definition of how long that we need to counter on the vulnerability that we found. Saying like like security patches. There is security patches come out for the product, we are given 3 weeks from the patches identified. So if the patches is identified, 3 weeks from that, we have to do assessment and resolve the vulnerability. This is the procedure. But the procedure is actually up to you. 3 weeks is actually, some people say it's too long, right? But realistically, 3 weeks, if you have 100 of servers, is quite a short time. So that's why how you have to word everything properly, because when audit come, they will refer to this document and look how you work. Saying like, hey, you say you are going to patch your server security vulnerability within 3 weeks, but why this server have not been patched for 1 year? So you have to justify and respond back to the audit. So that's so dekat sini what we put like some of the wording tricks is actually 3 weeks from the patch is identified. Some system we do not identify the patches. Whether the vulnerability is already found last year, but we only identified the vulnerability last week. So the count start from last week, right? So you have to define your type of patches and what the treatment for that patches. Then we can put a disclaimer on the end saying that if the treatment is not as scheduled, you have to report it as a risk report somewhere that require approval from management not to apply the patch. So that's how we do a patch management. Right. So after we do the patch management, so we have to provide a report. That's operation work. Identify the patch, do a risk assessment, implement the patch, and generate reports. So most of the time, manually, because that's the most cost efficient or when your system is small. So make up a monthly report. Easier, this one is a sample of reports or template of reports for Windows Server patch management. We list, because Windows is quite stable. Every Tuesday, second week, they will come out with their list of patch. Then we can look into whether the patch is applied to our organization, list of all the patch, list all the server impacted, and then plan. You can do the same checklist inside our change management process, right? And then there's a remark checklist. So this one, you have to provide a report, put a checklist, and then publish and get approval from your management. Templates required to make your work easier, because if you want to make a new template for every report, it will cost you a lot of time. So technical people, actually they do not have time to think about template. They just use whatever they have to make sure the work is done. They can do the work, but on reporting, we have to simplify the reporting form. So we go into checklist, form, reports, template, so that it's easier for them to do their reports. Okay? So that's how we manage. But this is all manual process. If you have 10 servers, Windows server with minimum vulnerability is okay. But what happens if you have hundreds of servers? You have Linux servers, you have Windows, and then you have other applications. So you have multiple applications and you don't know what is the vulnerability. Then you start to use tools. Okay, looking back into vulnerability, let's say, we have technical vulnerabilities, we have human vulnerabilities. That previous form only covers on maybe software vulnerabilities. But how about misconfiguration? How do we identify misconfiguration? Right. How about shadow IT? How about website vulnerabilities? So if an individual or technical person, system engineer is assigned that role, and realistically an organization can only have one or two system engineer to managing all this. So it will be a burden to that technical engineer. So that's why we recommend that you start using tools. Okay. So next gen vulnerability management tools. So when we look into characteristic of tools that we need to help us, so the tools should be able to extend attack vector coverage, which means that it can cover not only your technical asset, but also your human asset. So they have an automatic scan to cover your technical asset, then identify the vulnerabilities, but also have some manual features that you can cover that or record the human vulnerabilities. And then through unification, where it can display you the risk of technical and business together. Because realistically, technical people cannot present well to the management, the board, on the risk of IT risk. Because board will only see the summary. They don't want to know what is the vulnerability, how many vulnerability you have on your infrastructure. So to present to the board member, you have to present a simpler way, saying that, okay, giving a rating to your security exposure. Now currently is F. We need to improve our vulnerability exposure to A. So we must have a tools that can translate the technical into a business mindset. And then a total coverage, asset coverage. So the tools must cover all your assets. And then attack surface management. The tools can help you manage your attack surface, your exposure from internet, your exposure from internal attack. So the tools can help you in managing that. One of the tools that we can use is actually vulnerability management tools. There's a lot in the market, but what we can see, this is the dashboard of the tools. It gives you an account score. It gives you a rating of currently your asset vulnerability and put a score there. So for the management, they say, hey, 47 out of 100. We are below industry. And then they compare with industry benchmark. So the management understand that 47 is low, below 50, half. So then the management is expecting you are 19. So when they understand, then it's easy for you to get the budget. Then the detail of the vulnerability, whether the vulnerability is high risk, low risk, or medium risk. So you can look into the tools. Other things like a manual, below that is a manual input, the remedies. When you do all the vulnerability, you update the system saying that the vulnerability is already covered. Not only for the technical, but maybe on the human vulnerability. Okay, so find the tools that will help you managing the vulnerability. So from that, you don't need all these templates, report, checklist. But you just refer to the tools, cover your vulnerabilities. They already done all the assessment, and then you prioritize which one you want to do first. Okay, and then if you want to get the details, the tools can assist you in details. Which one is high? How many servers? What you need to do? They also can recommend you what you have to do. Sometimes, if there's no patch available for that vulnerability, they will recommend the best way to configure your servers for that. Right? So it's all graphic. So easy to understand by a newcomer or experienced engineer, and also by the management. Right. Okay, that's all the slides for today. I think 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rizaki, for the wonderful presentation. Please give a big round of applause to Mr. Rizaki. All right?
Thank you.
So, upcoming next, just stay because we have another presentation. Only after this, okay, just stay because we're going to have presentation from the NS Vault Sendian Berhad. All right? Thank you, Mr. Rizaki.